I files for divorce. During the divorce hearing, I asked the judge, "May I show you something that my husband and my daughter don't know about, Your Honor?" The judge nodded. "Go on, my dear." When the video started playing, the entire courtroom froze in silence. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you'd give them your whole heart, only to discover they were ripping it apart behind your back? What if that betrayal came from the two people you loved most in this world? Today, I'm bringing you a story so shocking, so heartbreaking, that when the evidence was revealed in court, the entire room fell into stunned silence. This is the story of Margaret Chen, a woman who thought she'd found love again at 63, only to uncover a betrayal so devastating it would shake the very foundation of her family forever. But before we dive into this incredible true story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories like these. And I want to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you watching this from? Are you Team Margaret? Let me know your thoughts as this story unfolds, and please tell me which country or city you're tuning in from. Now let's get into this unbelievable tale. Margaret Chen had always been the kind of woman who believed in second chances. After losing her husband Robert to cancer 5 years ago, she thought her chapter of romance had closed forever. She threw herself into being the best grandmother she could be, spending her days volunteering at the local library, tending to her garden, and spoiling her 2 grandchildren, 7-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Lucas. Her daughter, 38-year-old Victoria, had divorced 2 years prior and had moved back into Margaret's spacious home in the suburbs of Portland with the kids. Margaret didn't mind at all. In fact, she cherished having her family close, even if it meant her peaceful retirement had become a bustling household full of toys, laughter, and the occasional tantrum. But then, on a crisp autumn morning at a charity fundraiser for the local animal shelter, Margaret met Daniel Pierce. At 35 years old, Daniel was handsome in that rugged, effortless way that made heads turn. With dark, wavy hair that fell just above his collar, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room, he was the kind of man who seemed too good to be true. And perhaps, as Margaret would later discover, he was. Daniel worked as a freelance photographer, traveling for work, but always returning to Portland, which he called home. He approached Margaret at the fundraiser, complimenting her on the silk scarf she wore, saying it reminded him of something his late mother used to wear. They talked for hours that day, about loss, about healing, about finding joy in unexpected places. Their courtship was whirlwind and romantic. Daniel brought her flowers every week, not the generic roses from the grocery store, but carefully selected bouquets of her favorite peonies and tulips. He took her to small jazz clubs in the city, cooked elaborate Italian dinners in her kitchen, and listened with genuine interest when she spoke about her late husband, never showing a hint of jealousy or discomfort. Victoria seemed happy for her mother, encouraging the relationship, telling Margaret she deserved to be happy again. The grandchildren adored Daniel too. He'd spend hours playing with them in the backyard, building elaborate forts, and teaching Lucas about different types of cameras. He seemed perfect. Almost too perfect. After 8 months of dating, Daniel proposed to Margaret during a weekend trip to the coast. They were walking along Cannon Beach at sunset when he got down on one knee, presenting her with a vintage sapphire ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Margaret said yes, without hesitation, tears streaming down her face. They married in a small, intimate ceremony 3 months later, surrounded by close friends and family. Victoria served as her mother's maid of honor, looking radiant in a navy blue dress, helping Margaret into her cream-colored gown and whispering how proud she was, how happy she was that her mother had found love again. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Daniel officially moved into Margaret's home, converting one of the spare rooms into a photography studio. He seemed to fit seamlessly into their family dynamic, helping Victoria with the kids, joining them for movie nights, and even teaching Emma about photography, letting her use one of his older cameras. Margaret felt like the luckiest woman alive. She'd found love when she least expected it, and her family seemed more united than ever. But then, small things started to feel off. Daniel began working late more frequently, claiming he'd picked up several new clients who needed evening shoots. Margaret would wake in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed cold and empty. When she'd ask about it in the morning, he'd kiss her forehead and explain he'd fallen asleep in his studio, editing photos, not wanting to disturb her. She believed him because why wouldn't she? This was the man she'd married, the man she trusted with her heart. Victoria's behavior shifted too, though so subtly, Margaret almost didn't notice at first. Her daughters started spending more time out of the house, joining a gym she claimed was helping her get back into shape after the divorce. She'd leave in the evenings, dressed in athletic wear, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, returning hours later with flushed cheeks and a strange lightness in her step. She'd started paying more attention to her appearance too, getting her hair colored more frequently, wearing makeup even on casual days at home, buying new clothes that Margaret noticed were more form-fitting, more youthful than her usual style. One evening, about 4 months into her marriage, Margaret came home early from her library volunteer shift. The library had closed unexpectedly due to a plumbing issue, and she'd decided to surprise Daniel by picking up his favorite Thai food for dinner. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed Victoria's car was still there, which was odd because her daughter had mentioned going to the gym. The house felt unusually quiet when Margaret entered through the front door. The kids were at their father's place for the weekend, something that had been arranged weeks ago. Margaret set the takeout bags on the kitchen counter and called out for Daniel and Victoria, but received no response. She walked through the living room, noticing Victoria's gym bag tossed carelessly on the couch, the zipper open, revealing street clothes inside, not workout gear. A strange feeling settled in Margaret's stomach, something she couldn't quite name. She climbed the stairs slowly, her heart beginning to race, for reasons she didn't understand. The door to Daniel's studio was closed, which wasn't unusual. But as she approached, she heard something that made her freeze. Laughter. Low and intimate. Victoria's laughter, followed by Daniel's voice. Too muffled to make out the words, but unmistakably warm, unmistakably affectionate. Margaret's hand hovered over the doorknob. Part of her wanted to throw the door open immediately. But another part, the part that had survived loss and heartbreak before, told her to be smart about this. She backed away from the door slowly, her mind racing. She needed proof. She needed to be absolutely certain before she confronted what her instincts were screaming at her. Margaret retreated downstairs, her hands shaking as she picked up her purse and keys. She left the Thai food on the counter and walked out of her own home, sitting in her car for nearly 20 minutes trying to steady her breathing, trying to think clearly through the fog of shock and disbelief that was clouding her mind. Over the next 3 days, Margaret moved through her life like a ghost, mechanically going through the motions while her mind raced with possibilities. She wanted desperately to be wrong, to find some innocent explanation for what she'd heard, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. She observed Daniel and Victoria with new eyes, watching how they interacted, looking for signs she might have missed. And once she started looking, she saw them everywhere. The The way Victoria's eyes would linger on Daniel when she thought no one was watching. The way Daniel would find excuses to be in the same room as Victoria, offering to help her with dishes, volunteering to run errands with her. The inside jokes they seemed to share, conversations that would stop abruptly when Margaret entered a room. Margaret knew she needed evidence, something concrete that would either confirm her suspicions or prove her wrong. She couldn't confront them based on a feeling, based on laughter heard through a closed door. She needed to see with her own eyes what was happening in her home, under her own roof. That's when she remembered her son-in-law, Victoria's ex-husband, Christopher, mentioning during the divorce proceedings that he'd installed small security cameras throughout his house to monitor the nanny they'd hired. Margaret had thought it was excessive at the time, perhaps even paranoid, but now she understood the impulse to protect yourself, to seek truth when you suspected betrayal. On a Tuesday morning, while Daniel was out meeting a client and Victoria had taken the children to school, Margaret drove to an electronics store across town where no one would recognize her. She felt almost criminal standing in the surveillance equipment aisle, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the small, discreet cameras marketed for home security. A young salesman approached, offering help, and Margaret found herself lying smoothly, explaining she wanted to monitor her home while she traveled to visit relatives. The lie came easier than she expected. She purchased 2 small cameras, ones that could be easily hidden and connected to an app on her phone, allowing her to view the footage remotely. That afternoon, Margaret installed the first camera in the living room, tucking it behind a decorative vase on the bookshelf where it had a clear view of the couch and entryway. Her hands were steadier than she expected as she adjusted the angle, testing the feed on her phone. The second camera she placed in Daniel's photography studio, a decision that made her stomach turn with guilt and determination in equal measure. She waited until she knew he'd be gone for several hours, using the key he'd given her to enter his private space. The studio smelled like him, a mixture of cologne and the faint chemical scent of photo-developing solution. Margaret hid the camera on a high shelf between photography equipment, angling it to capture the center of the room, where Daniel kept his computer desk and a small couch he used for client consultations. With the cameras in place, Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Now all she could do was wait and watch. She went about her regular activities, volunteering at the library, having lunch with her friends, playing with Emma and Lucas, all while the app on her phone sat like a loaded weapon in her purse. She checked it obsessively those first few days, always when she was alone, watching mundane footage of Daniel working at his computer, of Victoria playing with the kids, of normal family life unfolding in pixelated silence. Then, on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after she'd installed the cameras, Margaret attended her monthly book club meeting. She'd almost canceled, the anxiety of leaving her cameras unwatched for several hours making her feel physically ill, but she forced herself to go, knowing that breaking her routine might raise suspicions. The book club met at her friend Patricia's house, and Margaret sat through 2 hours of discussion about a mystery novel, barely hearing a word, her phone clutched in her lap under the table. When she finally made it to her car after the meeting ended, she sat in Patricia's driveway and opened the camera app with shaking hands. The living room feed showed nothing unusual, just an empty room with the lamps left on. But when she switched to the studio feed, her heart stopped. There they were, Daniel and Victoria, her husband and her daughter. Victoria was sitting on the couch, and Daniel stood nearby, his hand on her shoulder, in a gesture that was far too familiar, far too intimate. Margaret's finger hovered over the screen, almost unable to force herself to press play, to hear what they were saying. When she finally did, the volume turned low in the quiet car. She heard Victoria's voice saying something about being careful, about Margaret's book club meeting usually running until 9. And then Daniel leaned down and kissed her. Not a friendly peck, not an accidental brush of lips, but a deep, passionate kiss that spoke of practice, of repetition, of a relationship that had clearly been going on for far longer than Margaret wanted to imagine. Margaret watched, frozen, as her daughter and her husband embraced in a way that shattered every illusion she'd been holding on to. They pulled apart, and Victoria laughed. That same laugh Margaret had heard through the studio door weeks ago, saying something about how much easier this was when the kids were at their father's place and Margaret was predictably occupied. Daniel responded by pulling Victoria closer, his hands in places that made Margaret want to throw her phone across the parking lot. Instead, she kept watching, forcing herself to witness every moment, every touch, every kiss. She needed to see it all. She needed evidence that would be undeniable. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret collected footage meticulously. She discovered that Daniel and Victoria had established patterns, times when they knew she'd be gone. They'd wait for her to leave for the library, or for her weekly dinner with old friends from Robert's office, or for the afternoons when she took Emma and Lucas to the park. The footage showed them throughout the house, in the studio, in the living room when the kids were at school, behaving like lovers who'd been together for years. Margaret watched every second, each moment driving a dagger deeper into her heart, but also strengthening her resolve. She downloaded each video file, backed them up on a secure drive, organized them by date and time. She was building a case, though she wasn't quite sure yet what she planned to do with it. During this time, Margaret had to continue living in the house with them both, had to smile at breakfast, had to accept Daniel's kisses, had to listen to Victoria talk about her day. It was the most difficult performance of her life. There were moments she almost broke, moments when the rage and hurt threatened to explode out of her, but she held it together through sheer force of will. She thought about Robert, about how he'd taught her to be strategic, to think several moves ahead. She thought about her grandchildren, about Emma and Lucas, who would be affected by whatever came next. And she thought about justice, about making sure that Daniel and Victoria faced consequences for what they'd done. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after she'd installed the cameras. Margaret had told Daniel and Victoria she was driving to Seattle to visit an old college friend, a trip she'd mentioned weeks ago. She'd even packed a bag, kissed Daniel goodbye, and driven out of the neighborhood. But instead of heading north to Seattle, Margaret drove to a coffee shop 10 minutes away and parked, watching the camera feeds on her phone. Within 30 minutes of her supposed departure, Daniel appeared in the studio feed, and shortly after, Victoria entered. They didn't waste any time. Margaret watched as they embraced immediately, as Daniel pushed Victoria against the desk. As clothing started coming off, Margaret turned off her phone, unable to watch anymore. She sat in her car, tears streaming down her face for the first time since this nightmare had begun. She'd been holding everything in, staying strong, staying focused. But in that moment, the full weight of the betrayal crashed over her. Her daughter. Her own daughter. The child she'd given birth to, raised, supported through her own divorce, welcomed back into her home. And her husband, the man she'd trusted with her heart, the man she'd believed was her second chance at happiness. How long had this been going on? Had it started before the wedding? Had Victoria been sleeping with Daniel while serving as maid of honor, while helping her mother into her wedding dress, while giving that touching toast about love and second chances. Margaret drove home that evening with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The crying had stopped, replaced by a cold, calculated determination. She'd made her decision. She would file for divorce, and she would make sure that when she did, the truth would come out in the most undeniable way possible. She would not let Daniel gaslight her, would not let Victoria make excuses or minimize what they'd done. The evidence on her phone was irrefutable, and she planned to use every second of it. When she arrived home, her overnight bag still in the trunk to maintain the illusion of her Seattle trip, she found Daniel in the kitchen making dinner, looking relaxed and happy. He greeted her with surprise, asking why she was back so early. Margaret delivered her prepared lies smoothly, explaining that her friend had come down with the flu and had to cancel. So she'd decided to come back rather than get a hotel. Daniel seemed to accept this without question, giving her a hug and saying he was glad she was home. Victoria appeared from upstairs moments later, also seeming surprised but pleased to see her mother. Margaret hugged her daughter, feeling Victoria's arms wrap around her, and for a brief moment, she almost broke down again. This was her baby girl, the child she'd nursed through fevers and heartbreaks, the woman she'd supported through her own difficult divorce. How could Victoria do this to her? But Margaret held herself together, smiling and chatting through dinner, playing with Emma and Lucas, acting as though nothing in the world was wrong. That night, lying in bed next to Daniel, feeling him breathe beside her in sleep, Margaret stared at the ceiling and planned her next moves. She would need a lawyer, a good one, someone who specialized in divorce cases and understood how to handle complex situations. She would need to secure her finances, make sure Daniel couldn't access her accounts or the assets she'd accumulated before their marriage. And she would need to do all of this without tipping them off, without giving Victoria or Daniel any warning about what was coming. The next morning, Margaret called in sick to her library volunteer shift and instead drove to a law office downtown that a friend had recommended years ago during Victoria's divorce. The attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Rebecca Morrison, listened to Margaret's story with an expression that shifted from professional neutrality to genuine shock as the details emerged. When Margaret showed her some of the video footage on her phone, Rebecca's eyes widened, and she sat back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. She told Margaret that in her 23 years of practicing family law, she'd seen plenty of infidelity cases, but this particular situation, with a daughter and stepfather, was among the most egregious betrayals she'd encountered. Rebecca laid out Margaret's options clearly. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, which meant Margaret didn't technically need to prove infidelity to dissolve the marriage, but the evidence would certainly be relevant in matters of asset division and potentially in filing for a fault-based divorce that could affect spousal support claims Daniel might make. Rebecca explained that given the short duration of the marriage and Oregon's laws, Daniel would have limited claims to Margaret's premarital assets, but they needed to move quickly and strategically. She advised Margaret to gather all financial documents, to secure her important papers, and to be prepared for the emotional fallout that would inevitably come when the truth emerged publicly. Over the next week, Margaret worked methodically. She made copies of bank statements, investment accounts, the deed to her house, and Robert's life insurance documents. She moved most of her cash into a separate account at a different bank, one that Daniel had no knowledge of or access to. She contacted her financial advisor and updated her will, removing Daniel completely and ensuring everything would go to Victoria's children if something happened to her. With the trust managed by her brother Thomas, rather than Victoria. That particular change broke her heart in a new way. She'd always planned to leave everything to Victoria eventually, but now, knowing what her daughter had done, Margaret couldn't trust her with that responsibility. Margaret also confided in her brother Thomas, who lived 3 states away in Colorado. The phone call was one of the hardest conversations of her life. Thomas had liked Daniel, had given a speech at the wedding about how happy he was that his sister had found love again. When Margaret told him what she'd discovered, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before Thomas began cursing in a way Margaret had never heard from her usually mild-mannered brother. He offered to fly out immediately, to be there when she confronted them, but Margaret declined. She needed to do this her way, in her own time, with the legal system as her ally, rather than through family confrontation that could turn messy. 2 weeks after her meeting with Rebecca, Margaret filed for divorce. The papers were served to Daniel at the house on a Wednesday morning while Victoria was out taking the kids to school. Margaret had arranged to be at the library, wanting to be far away when Daniel received the documents. Rebecca had warned her that he would likely call immediately, confused, angry, or possibly playing innocent. Sure enough, Margaret's phone began ringing within 15 minutes of the process server's visit. She let it go to voicemail. Daniel called 6 more times over the next hour, each voicemail growing progressively more panicked, asking what was going on, saying there must be some mistake, begging her to call him back. When Margaret finally returned home that evening, she found Daniel waiting for her in the living room, the divorce papers spread on the coffee table in front of him. Victoria was there too, sitting on the couch with a confused expression, clearly having been told about the situation. The moment Margaret walked through the door, Daniel jumped up, his face a mixture of shock and hurt, demanding to know what was happening, asking why she was doing this. Victoria stood as well, moving toward her mother, reaching out to take her hands, saying they needed to talk about this, asking if something had happened, if Margaret was okay. Margaret looked at them both, these 2 people she'd loved and trusted completely, and felt nothing but cold resolve. She pulled her hands away from Victoria's grasp and said simply that she knew everything. The effect of those 3 words was instantaneous. Daniel's face went pale, and Victoria's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like fear. There was a moment of heavy silence before Daniel started stammering, asking what she meant, trying to bluff his way through. But Margaret cut him off, her voice steady and calm in a way that surprised even herself. She told them she'd seen the videos, that she had evidence of everything, and that they should both save their denials and excuses because she wasn't interested in hearing them. Victoria started crying immediately, sinking back onto the couch, her face crumbling as she whispered that she was sorry, that she never meant for it to happen. Daniel tried a different approach, moving toward Margaret, trying to take her in his arms, saying they could work through this, that it was a mistake, that he loved her. Margaret stepped back from his touch as though he were poisonous, telling him not to come near her, that she wanted him out of the house immediately. When Daniel protested, saying he had rights as her husband, Margaret informed him that her attorney had already filed a restraining order that would be processed by the end of the week, and that he should pack his essential items and leave before she called the police. The scene that followed was chaotic and painful. Daniel oscillated between anger and pleading, at one point trying to claim that Margaret had it all wrong, that she'd misunderstood what she'd seen. But when Margaret pulled out her phone and offered to play the footage right there, he fell silent. Victoria continued sobbing, trying repeatedly to approach her mother, to explain, to apologize. But Margaret couldn't even look at her. The betrayal from Victoria somehow hurt even more than Daniel's. Margaret had only known Daniel for a little over a year, but Victoria was her daughter, her flesh and blood, someone she'd loved unconditionally for 38 years. Emma and Lucas were at their father Christopher's house that night, something Margaret had arranged deliberately, knowing this confrontation was coming. She was grateful they weren't there to witness their grandmother, mother, and step-grandfather falling apart. Within 2 hours, Daniel had packed several bags and left, though not before making various threats about fighting the divorce, about his rights, about how Margaret would regret treating him this way. Margaret stood firm through all of it, her arms crossed, her expression impassive, until finally he was gone. Judge Winters handed the tablet back to Margaret and sat back in her chair, removing her glasses and pinching the bridge of her nose as though trying to process what she'd just witnessed. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Daniel had gone white as a sheet, finally understanding that Margaret hadn't been bluffing, that she had concrete, irrefutable evidence of everything. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear, but Daniel just sat there, frozen, staring at the table in front of him. Margaret returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but her exterior calm. She'd done it. She'd shown the truth in the most powerful way possible. Judge Winters put her glasses back on and cleared her throat, her voice carrying a weight that commanded immediate attention. I'm going to request that the video evidence be submitted formally to the court. Mrs. Chen, your attorney will need to provide copies for the record. Rebecca nodded, already prepared with USB drives containing all the footage, organized and time-stamped. The judge continued, I want to be very clear about something. In my years on the bench, I have presided over countless divorce proceedings involving infidelity. But what I've just witnessed represents a level of betrayal that goes beyond a simple extramarital affair. She turned her attention to Daniel, her expression hardening. Mr. Pierce, you entered into a marriage with Mrs. Chen under what appears to be false pretenses. You integrated yourself into her family, her home, and her life, all while conducting a relationship with her daughter. The power dynamics here, the violation of familial trust, and the calculated nature of this deception are deeply troubling. Daniel's attorney tried to interject, to say something in his client's defense, but Judge Winters held up her hand, silencing him. I've seen enough to make some preliminary rulings. This video evidence is absolutely admissible. It was recorded by Mrs. Chen in her own home, in spaces where she had every right to monitor activity. There is no reasonable expectation of privacy when you're conducting an affair in someone else's house. The judge looked down at the papers in front of her, making notes with swift, decisive strokes of her pen. Here's what's going to happen. This divorce is granted, effective immediately. There will be no spousal support awarded to Mr. Pierce under any circumstances. All premarital assets remain with Mrs. Chen, along with any assets acquired during the marriage, which appear to be minimal. Mr. Pierce, you have forfeited any claim to any portion of Mrs. Chen's estate, property, or finances through your egregious conduct. Daniel's face crumbled, and he put his head in his hands. His attorney started to object, citing Oregon law about equitable distribution, but Judge Winters cut him off sharply. Counselor, I suggest you advise your client to accept this ruling quietly. Because if we continue with a full hearing, and I'm required to watch more of that video evidence, if I'm required to document in detail the nature and extent of Mr. Pierce's affair with his stepdaughter, it will become part of the permanent public record in a much more explicit way than it currently is. Is that really what your client wants? The attorney consulted with Daniel in hushed, urgent whispers. After a moment, Daniel shook his head, defeated. His attorney informed the court that they would not contest the ruling. But Judge Winters wasn't finished. She turned her attention back to Margaret, and her expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that the court recognizes the extraordinary courage it took for you to come forward with this evidence. To expose something so deeply personal and painful in pursuit of justice. You conducted yourself with remarkable dignity throughout this process. I'm also going to order that Mr. Pierce be responsible for all court costs and attorney fees on both sides, given that his conduct necessitated these proceedings." Rebecca squeezed Margaret's hand under the table, a small gesture of victory and support. The hearing concluded quickly after that. Judge Winters signed the divorce decree right there in the courtroom. An unusual move, but one that underscored the gravity of the situation. As people began to file out, several court staff members approached Margaret quietly, expressing sympathy and admiration for her strength. One older bailiff, a man who looked close to retirement, told her that in 30 years of working in family court, he'd never seen anyone handle a situation like this with more grace. Margaret thanked them all, feeling emotionally exhausted, but also lighter than she'd felt in months. It was over. The marriage was dissolved. Daniel was out of her life, legally and permanently. Thomas drove Margaret home, both of them quiet in the car, processing everything that had happened. When they arrived at the house, Victoria's car was in the driveway. Margaret's stomach clenched. She'd known this confrontation was coming eventually, but she'd hoped to have more time to prepare. Thomas offered to come in with her, to be there as support, but Margaret declined. This was something she needed to face alone. She walked into her house, into the living room, where Victoria sat on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Emma and Lucas were nowhere to be seen, presumably at their father's house again. Victoria stood up immediately when Margaret entered, her voice breaking as she started to speak. "Mom, I heard about the hearing. I heard what happened in court. I know you probably never want to see me again, but please, please let me explain." Margaret set her purse down slowly, looking at her daughter, this woman she'd raised and loved for nearly 4 decades. Part of her wanted to rage, to scream, to demand answers to the 1,000 questions burning in her mind. But another part of her was simply tired, so tired of the anger and pain and betrayal. She sat down in the armchair across from Victoria and said quietly, "Explain what, Victoria?" "Explain how you could sleep with my husband. Explain how you could look me in the eye every day while conducting an affair under my own roof. What possible explanation could make any of this okay?" Victoria collapsed back onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. When she finally looked up, her face was blotchy and broken. "It started before you married him," she admitted, and Margaret felt her heart drop even further, even though part of her had suspected as much. Victoria continued through her tears. "It started about 2 months before your wedding. We were planning the ceremony together, and he was helping me with some things, and one night we were alone and it just happened. I tried to stop it, Mom. I swear I did. I knew it was wrong. I knew it would destroy you. But he was so attentive, so interested in me. And after my divorce, I was feeling so lonely and worthless, and he made me feel wanted again." Margaret listened, her face impassive, as Victoria continued. "After it happened the first time, I told him we could never do it again. But then it happened again, and again. And before I knew it, we were in too deep. I wanted to tell you so many times. I wanted to stop the wedding, but I was so ashamed, and I was scared of losing you. Scared of losing my home. Scared of what it would do to Emma and Lucas. So I just kept going, kept pretending, kept lying, and every day it got worse. Every day I hated myself more. Victoria looked at her mother with desperate, pleading eyes. I know I'm a terrible person. I know I'm the worst daughter in the world. But please, Mom, please don't shut me out forever. I can't lose you. You're all I have. Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, letting Victoria's words hang in the air. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but cold. You didn't lose me, Victoria. You threw me away. You made a choice, repeatedly, for months, to betray me in the worst possible way. You stood next to me at my wedding knowing you'd been sleeping with my fiancé. You lived in my house, ate my food, let me care for your children, all while conducting an affair with my husband. Those weren't mistakes, Victoria. Those were choices, deliberate, calculated choices. Victoria started to protest, to say again that she was sorry, but Margaret held up her hand. I need you to understand something, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tears that were finally falling down her own cheeks. I loved you unconditionally for 38 years. I would have done anything for you. When you went through your divorce, I opened my home to you without hesitation. I took care of Emma and Lucas. I supported you emotionally and financially. And this is how you repaid that love, by sleeping with my husband. Margaret stood up, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. You have 2 weeks to be completely moved out. That's more generous than you deserve. After that, if you want to have a relationship with me, it will be on my terms, and it will take years to rebuild, even a fraction of the trust you destroyed. Right now, I can't even look at you without feeling sick. Victoria broke down completely, begging her mother not to abandon her, promising she'd do anything to make it right. But Margaret was done. She'd said what she needed to say. She turned and walked upstairs to her bedroom, closing the door behind her, and finally allowing herself to completely fall apart. She cried for the marriage she'd lost, for the daughter who'd betrayed her, for the innocence and trust that had been shattered beyond repair. But somewhere beneath the grief and pain, there was also a sense of relief. She'd stood up for herself. She'd demanded justice. She'd refused to be a victim. Over the following weeks and months, Margaret slowly began to rebuild her life. Victoria moved out within the agreed-upon timeframe, finding a small apartment with help from Christopher. The relationship between mother and daughter remained fractured, though they began having brief, awkward phone calls every few weeks, mostly about Emma and Lucas. Margaret made it clear that any rebuilding of their relationship would be a years-long process, requiring genuine remorse and changed behavior from Victoria. Daniel disappeared from all their lives completely, and Margaret heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd left Portland entirely, moving somewhere back east. Margaret started therapy to process the trauma of what had happened. She rejoined her book club and her volunteer work at the library. She took a trip to Italy with Thomas and his wife, something she'd always wanted to do. She began, slowly and painfully, to heal. The betrayal would always be part of her story, a wound that had left a permanent scar, but it wouldn't define her. She was more than what had been done to her. She was Margaret Chen, a woman of strength and dignity who'd faced the worst kind of betrayal and come through it with her integrity intact. And on the nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when she wondered if she'd ever trust anyone again, Margaret would remember that moment in the courtroom. She'd remember Judge Winter's expression when the video started playing, the way the entire room had frozen in stunned silence, the way Daniel's face had crumbled when he realized his lies had been exposed. She'd remember standing up and asking to show the truth, and the power she'd felt in that moment. Margaret had taken her pain and turned it into justice. She'd refused to be silenced or dismissed. And that, she told herself, was something to be proud of. That was survival. That was strength. That was the beginning of healing.